Hello, and welcome back to History of Western Music. In this lesson, we're going to talk about the Renaissance, the rebirth era, the Renaissance period. This will be the first part of the Renaissance. Next week, you'll get the second part. Today, though, we're going to talk about the introductory history of the Renaissance period, what it's all about, and some of the musical elements that go along with it. The 15th and 16th centuries were a period of great change for European culture, literature, and art. And music. To some at the time, it seemed that the arts had been reborn after a period of stagnation. In his 1855 Histoire de France, Jules Michelet crystallized this notion in the term the Renaissance, which means rebirth. And soon, historians of literature, art, and music were using it to designate the historical period after the Middle Ages, or the medieval period. The idea of rebirth captures the aims of scholars and artists to restore the learning, ideals, and values of ancient Greece and Rome. But writers, artists, and musicians did far more than recover the old. Currents already strong in the late Middle Ages continued, innovations emerged in every field, and the introduction of new technologies, such as the printing press, brought radical change. In music, these centuries are better understood as a time of continual and overlapping changes than as a period characterized by a single unified style. From the early 15th century and on, musicians frequently held positions outside their native regions, especially in Italy. Their encounters with music and musicians from other regions led to the creation of a new international style, drawing on elements of French, Italian, and English traditions. This new style featured new rules for theory based on strict control of dissonance, marking a distinct break from the previous eras. These rules for theory and dissonance were followed by composers throughout the 15th and 16th centuries. So, we are dealing with 200 years in history, from 1400 to 1600. Now, there is a very strong presence of the English in France during this time, right? The English won in the 100 Years' War, as well as at Agincourt in 1415. English nobility brought musicians with them. As they came into France, they brought their cohorts of musicians with them, these group of musicians that would follow around those very wealthy and powerful men and women. Nearly all leading composers are from the Burgundy area, the Burgundian area, which is in northern France. Okay, they had this cosmopolitan style, this very popular style, very, very wealthy style of music. Now, the goal, as I said, right, of the Renaissance was this revival in the learning and ideals and values of both the ancient Greeks and the Romans. Many new technologies, such as the printing of music and musical instruments, the design of the instruments themselves, would help push along this rebirth from 1400 to 1600. There were different developments in musical genres and styles. New rules for theory. Printing became huge. Amateurs were allowed to play music at home, not just in the church. And there were new forms of religious music that included instruments, not just vocals. Now, there were many conflicts during this time. The 100 Years' War, right, which was the expulsion of the English from France, that ended. We also get the end of the Byzantine Empire. Constantinople fell to Turkey, to the Turks, in 1453 as well. Constantinople is modern-day Istanbul in Turkey. We get the rise of Western Europe as a world power, especially France and England during this time. There was an expansion across the Mediterranean, where Italians as well also traveled all around, conquering, colonizing all over. And Columbus in 1492 did this with the New World. They had larger ships, better navigational aids, and way more powerful artillery to defend themselves on their way there, and while they were there as well. But new conflicts emerged. Turks then conquered more territory, not just modern-day Turkey, but also the Balkans and Hungary. A lot of Eastern Europe was conquered by the Turks at this time. And there was this big split, this splintering, this schism, this schism in the church at this time. We call this the Reformation, where in 1517 there was this split from the very strict Roman Catholic Church, where others, especially in England and parts of France, as well as parts of the German Empire at this time, wanted to change up the rules in the way they governed their religions and the way they governed Christianity within their empires. The economy was stable in 1400 in Europe. There was an increase in trade. Towns and cities of all sizes prospered. The middle class grew in numbers and influence, and with the growth of the middle class came the growth in music as well, and those who played music. And so we really do see this revival in all things music. Rulers glorified themselves in this time. The idea of having groups of musicians follow you around gave these rulers this sense of wealth, right? They would throw massive parties, and the economy was able to back them up in that. We get this time of Renaissance in Italy. Now, Italy is a major player when we talk about Renaissance and this period. Italian musicians came from all over Italy. There was this rebirth in Italian geography and map making and where people came from. Commercial trade, so the trade in goods and services, dominated Italy in this time. And with that, there was this trade of musical ideas and people coming from all over Europe to trade in these ideas of music. Citizens accumulated giant wealth from commerce, banking, and different crafts such as smithery and ironwork, but also music. Art and architecture dominated the Renaissance in Italy. We get the photo in the background, a very famous photo, okay, where architecture was at its height. Then the Ottomans attacked. The Byzantines, starting to really expand the Ottoman Empire, and Byzantium is this, what we call modern-day Turkey. And so many Byzantines actually fled from Turkey, or from Byzantium, to Italy. And with that, they brought ancient Greek texts. And that is what the rebirth was all about, especially in Italy, right? The revival of the Greek and old Roman ways. Classics such as Homer's Iliad from Greece were translated into Latin for the very first time. The rebirth was strong. Humanism, this movement towards the Renaissance, the movement towards this rebirth. Humanism is that revival of ancient learning and ancient knowledge. People wanted to learn like the ancients did back 1,000 years from then. They wanted to learn and learn how to think. Humanism is the strongest intellectual movement of the Renaissance, and it not only was in the intellect side of things, but it also moved towards art and architecture and music and poetry. The church borrowed from classical sources and sponsored classical studies, and the popes at the time of the 15th, 16th centuries, as well as the 17th century, really and truly wanted to revive this idea of the classics from Greece and from Rome, recreating sculptures, recreating the sounds that they would find in these times. Composers applied these ideas from ancient speeches, from Cicero, from Aristotle, and imposed them into their music. So many of our modern day operas are based on ancient historical events or writings. And so they revived them in their music. So now we come to art and architecture, right? Classical antiquity, so the ancient world. Naturalism, and they idealized the beauty in the human form as well as in the architecture itself. Nudity was huge. You see all the time in Greece and Rome and France and modern day England of statues which show nudity. But in the medieval period, in the Middle Ages, nakedness and nudity, shame, shame. You cannot have that. But in this time of Renaissance, this time of rebirth, it was okay. Painting and architecture evolved. The idea of realism and natural beauty of the human form and the natural beauty of nature itself was depicted in 3D space on a flat surface in what we call perspective today. There was interest in the individual, the person itself, how the human form was shaped and how it could be drawn and painted. In architecture, both Roman and English, as well as French Renaissance architecture, was all based on the classical models from old ancient Rome and Greece. The columns, the giant Greek columns you see today, were implied in the Renaissance period. We now turn to music in the Renaissance, kind of the main topic of what we've been talking about, right? Music in the Renaissance is all about the training of musicians and music in the court, right? Musicians at this time were paid well. They would play at the courts of kings and queens and powerful rulers all across Europe and be paid quite well. And the more elaborate and the more exciting their music was, the more likely they were to get more customers wanting their music, wanting their performances, wanting their compositions. The training system applied to two separate schools. There was the guilds, which had the apprenticeship type training, much like as a plumber would today, or an architect, or a welder. But there were also cathedral schools or choirs that would have training in the churches themselves, the cathedrals themselves. And when we turn to music in France, at the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris, we get a lot of choirs and cathedral schools that implored only men, which was really unfortunate. Composers, though, were trained as choir boys first. Choir schools taught singing, music theory, basic theology, and other subjects related to the church. Only male children were allowed in the choir, and as we talked in the last lesson, there was a section of these boys' choirs called the castrati, where quite literally boys would be castrated before they hit the age of puberty so that their voices, their vocal cords, would not be changed and would not be lowered due to hormones. Nuns received education in convents. Cities with renowned music training are Cambrai, Bruges, Antwerp, Paris, Lyon. And in the 16th century, Rome and Venice became centers for musical training in terms of these cathedral schools. So, mobile musicians, what does this mean? Well, we get a lot of musicians coming to play together from all across Europe. And with musicians coming together from all these different countries and kingdoms, the styles then were shared among one another and new genres came about. Here we have in this main strip, this main belt here, okay, all the way from Naples or Napoli, all the way up to London. You see this stretch of territory in Western Europe. All of these were centers of major schools for training musicians or for training musical patronage in the Renaissance. And the main ones, right, we have Lyon, Florence, Rome, Paris, Bruges, Cambrai, Antwerp, and London. These were the main areas. Now, when we talk about performance in terms of musicians in the Renaissance, ensembles of like instruments were common. So you would have these small or kind of medium-sized ensembles with everyone playing the lute or everyone playing the lyre, or version of the harp, or everyone playing these type of flutes. Secular or non-church music became really popular during this time because musicians were free to play instruments and were free to play music outside of the church for the first time in history. The choice of performing forced musicians to move away from the church because they were more free in what they could do. Pieces could be sung or played by instruments or a combination of both. Remember, in the medieval period, music, this idea of chants and Gregorian chants that came out of early musicians in Rome and then moving into Paris, you could not have instruments. It was forbidden because music was the servant to the church. And so instruments were forbidden, only it was sung. But in this time of the Renaissance, instruments and the technology of instrumentation and designing these instruments became huge. By the way, you can find this presentation on our Google Classroom if you would like to pause and read more. Here we have the music in the Elizabethan era. You can see these musicians who are all playing lutes. Okay, and my guess too is that perhaps these folks behind the lute players, they may be singers as well. But they would be at these court sessions, right? Big ceremonies, times of royalty. These musicians would be paid to play during this time. Music and words. Music and words and poetry is, I cannot stress enough, it is so important in the Renaissance period. Music was always put to words, just like in the medieval period, except it's always put towards poetry. And this idea of expressing yourself in many, many different ways. The expressive goal of music during the Renaissance was tied very closely to the rhythm of our speech and the syllables that come out of our speech. Printing was another major success in this time period. The printing press, developed in 1450 by Johann Gutenberg, was first used for chant notation in the 1470s. So chant notation of the church, just like the Gregorian chants we looked at last lesson, were some of the first music ever printed using movable type, the actual printing type press. The benefit of music printing allowed for music to be widely spread and disseminated throughout Europe. People could get music very quickly, very easily, and for relatively cheap if you could read it. Amateur music making became huge during this time. It boomed during the idea and the concept of the printing of music because it was marketed towards amateurs, people who wanted to learn, people who were had a little bit of training from the church, but then could play at home and expand and actually kind of make a business out of it. This idea of printed music gave us the preservation of music. We use printed music even till today. Before this time and during the medieval or the Middle Ages, music wasn't printed. So a lot of that music is actually lost to us, and we don't have a lot of it today. And here's just a couple of examples of the printed music. Now remember, if you take a look here in the bottom right, we have music that has words set to it. Remember, it's all set to poetry. Okay. Laudate eum omnes populi referexit domus, referexit Dominus, Alleluia. Okay, so all this music, remember, we're still in this Latinized world. It's all in Latin. Okay, and on the left here, we actually have a printed, it's a printed book, an instrument book, all about how to play the recorder or the flute, right? Opera intitulata Fontegara, the flute, the book of the flute, or the recorder. Now, the madrigal became huge during this time. The madrigal in the Renaissance music was kind of the main genre and style of music during this time. We get people who came in groups of 3 to 8 who would sing together. They would have these music books, these choral books with them, where they could sing together in different parts, especially if they were trained. Women in music were really big here, because if you will remember, during the Middle Ages and the medieval period, women were not found in the church choirs. It were only boys, only men. And so well-bred women, when we say well-bred women, we mean women of status, women with wealth, had a form of music education that they would be brought up with, especially if their families had high religious beliefs and attended church service often. Women achieved fame as professional singers, especially in the latter half of the 16th century or the 1500s. The most important genre of music during the Renaissance is the madrigal, as we said. Now, we call this the most important secular genre, so it's non-church music. Okay, and we'll talk about what is the most important church music during this time. Poetry and music were clearly linked. This was the aristocratic form. It was very prominent in the Italian courts. And we have several different topics that madrigals would be written to. Love, unrequited love, humor and satire and politics, the scene of the city and country life, all depicted in musical form, with lyrics that come from poems derived on these topics. Here are just some examples of some musicians. Claudio Monteverdi, very influential Italian madrigalist. He's very artful and influential as a composer. He declared music served the expressive power of text. Music was the slave to the text. This combination of poetry and music together, inseparable. In England, we've got a lot of different madrigalists. The most important and most notable is John Farmer. Now, English madrigals flourished during the Elizabethan era. They developed from Italian madrigals, and they were just simpler in text and lighter in style, easier to dance to. And as an example, we have this Fair Phyllis madrigal. The madrigal title is Fair Phyllis by John Farmer. It's for 4 voices, written in a cappella style, so no instrumentation. And it's very lighthearted and very lively with dance-like rhythms. So take a look at that. Hit the link in our Google Classroom slide and have a listen for yourselves. It's pretty awesome. All right, here we are at the very end of our lesson, the legacy of the Renaissance. How does the Renaissance tie into all these later periods? Well, the musical language of the Renaissance forged in the Renaissance, it lasted for generations. In the 16th century, we see some of the styles still used. The training in 16th century theory and composition is still used in later periods in the 17th and 18th centuries. Bach and Beethoven from the 17th and 18th centuries imitate styles in choral music that is found during this time. In the late 19th and 20th centuries, there was this revival of Renaissance music again, a new Renaissance, a neo-Renaissance. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, not that long ago. And the music of the Renaissance has been transcribed into modern day notation. It has been edited, it has been published, and it is still performed today by groups around the world. So that's all I have to say about the Renaissance so far. This is only part 1. Next week we'll get to part 2 and talk about 3 of the most influential Renaissance musicians, composers, and performers. Thanks a lot. I hope everybody has an awesome week ahead. Adios for now.